going. So yeah, there you go. Perfect.
Thank you very much. Can I just confirm you can see my slides okay?
Yeah, that's all good.
Great. So thank you very much, Tash, for the kind introduction. It's lovely to be able to speak to you about some of my research today. So as Tash said, I'm obviously currently a lecturer at Bath Spa, but the research that I'm going to talk to you about today was done as part of my PhD, which I did across the universities of Bath and Exeter, and was funded by the Medical Research Council. So my PhD research is about multisensory processing, specifically multisensory processing of emotion in the context of disorders such as anxiety and post-traumatic stress. And I'm going to focus on some of my work around anxiety today in my talk, bringing it all together, multisensory integration of emotion in anxiety. So I thought I'd start with a definition of what multisensory integration is, because unless you're really into this niche area of research like me, it's probably not something that you've taken the time to think much about before. So we define multisensory integration as the process by which information from our different senses is integrated together to help us produce coherent perceptions of the objects in our environment. And basically, the way that we perceive the world is very messy. There's a lot of ambiguity, both in the world around us, and there's also some noise in our sensory systems that the brain uses to process and perceive information. So we need to use a range of mechanisms to help us make sense of the overwhelming sensory signals in our environment and actually come to some sort of clear conclusion about what it is that we're experiencing. So multisensory integration is one of these mechanisms that helps us to make sense of the overwhelming information around us and to overcome the perceptual uncertainty that is inherent in our external world and also our sensory systems. So hopefully I've already illustrated just from that definition that multisensory integration is going to be an important process for helping us to make sense of the world, and it's required for appropriate and timely behavior within complex environments. And we can imagine how this might be particularly important when we're trying to interpret social and emotional information, because this can often be both very physically complex and also semantically ambiguous. So as well as being a lecturer, I'm also a bit of a budding YouTuber. It's something that I'm developing, so bear with me. But I thought I would show you a short snippet of one of my YouTube videos to give you a real world example of how multisensory integration can be important in social processing. So I'll give this a go. You're never quite sure how well these are going to play, but we'll see what happens.
I'm Naomi Heffer, PhD student and aspiring science communicator. And today I'm going to try and convince you of the importance of studying multisensory integration. This is the process by which our brains extract information from across the senses and combine this information to help us build up a fuller and more accurate impression of the world around us. One area where multisensory integration is particularly important in our lives is social processing. And here's an example to prove it. Watch the following clip and take note of what you hear. Bar, 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 bar. And now watch this. Bar, 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 bar. Sounded different, right? The sound that was being presented was actually exactly the same in both clips. Bar, but combined with the different mouth movements in the second clip, it sounded a lot less like bar and more like far or var. This goes to show that the mouth movements you see when you look at my face actually influence what you believe you're hearing. Go back and listen to the two clips again, and this time, keep your eyes closed. You'll notice that you hear the sound as it actually is, bar, and it's only when you open your eyes that the mouth movements can influence how the sound is heard. This is called the McGurk effect, and it's a product of multisensory integration, which happens when we combine the visual information from mouth movements with the auditory information from speech.
So there's more where that came from. So I can signpost you all to my very exciting YouTube channel at the end of the talk. If you haven't seen an example of the McGurk effect before, I would recommend you go and look at a video because it's really cool. And I think that might have been a bit laggy, so it might not have worked quite as well for you as it otherwise would do. But it's an example of how powerful these multisensory integration effects can be is that combining information from the visual cues from speech can really powerfully influence what you perceive you're hearing in the auditory domain. So that was just a quick demonstration of why multisensory processing is important, and one way that it can shape social perception by speech comprehension. But it also plays a key role in emotion recognition, as emotions can often be both physically complex and semantically ambiguous, and they're normally expressed via multiple senses. So in everyday life, we very rarely perceive emotional meaning based on information from one sense only. Instead, we typically rely on information from different types of cues, as illustrated in the diagram. This could include facial expression, voice prosody, so that's the variation in tone and pitch in speech, and body gesture. And there's even some evidence to suggest that body odor can influence how you perceive emotion from other people. There's some really cool research around that involving people inhaling the sweat of anxious people while they look at emotional faces and voices, which sounds slightly gross, but it's really interesting research. So definitely a topic that's worth looking into. And although I think that mind map is quite fun, I think this is a slightly more fun depiction of the point I'm trying to make about multisensory emotion processing. So this is a cake that I made to try and illustrate this point. So each of the different cakes are shaped like a puzzle piece, and they represent one of the senses that's important for emotion recognition. And you had to slot the 4 cakes together to form a full puzzle in order to see the full face and understand how the person was feeling. Obviously a lot more fun when you can also taste the cake, but just a slightly different visual representation there of this point about multimodal emotion perception. But even just within one sense, things are a lot more complicated in terms of emotion perception than just looking at static facial expressions. One type of cue that's very important that often isn't included in studies that look at emotion perception is biological motion. So quite often static stimuli are used, just like pictures of or photographs of faces. But motion is a hugely powerful communication signal, and we use it every day to help us attribute attentions and emotions to other people. And humans are very sensitive to the difference between biological and non-biological motion. And by that, I mean motion that's generated by people or generated by animals versus motion that is generated by inanimate objects or computers, for example. So we're very good at processing biological motion, and we can use it to very sensitively attribute emotional states and other cognitive states to other people. And as a fun example of how important biological motion is, this is one of the reasons why motion capture is used so often in films, because we're so sensitive to the difference between biological motion and non-biological motion. It's preferable for them to dress Benedict Cumberbatch up in a mocap suit and get him to roll around on the floor to animate the dragon in The Hobbit, rather than to try and do that using computer-generated motion, because we're so sensitive to the difference between biological and non-biological motion. So emotion perception is clearly a lot more complicated process than just looking at static pictures of faces and deciding whether people are happy or sad, even though that's the way that it's normally investigated. So it's been argued that emotion perception is inherently multimodal. Therefore, we can imagine that if people have difficulties with multisensory processing, this might disrupt their social and emotional processing, which could contribute to emotional or interpersonal problems. And there is actually evidence of altered multisensory processes in some populations who experience social and emotional difficulties. So, for example, it's been shown that there are difficulties specifically in multisensory processing in individuals with autism spectrum disorders. But despite this, there are very few studies that have examined multisensory processing in the context of anxiety and stress-related conditions, which was the subject of my PhD research. So we already have some existing research in anxiety, which suggests that there are differences in emotional processing. In anxiety disorders, there is evidence of increased depth of processing of threat-related cues, faster reaction times for responding to threat-related information, and also evidence that people with anxiety disorders are more likely to interpret ambiguous stimuli as threatening. So they're more likely to interpret neutral faces, for example, as being either fearful or disgusted. And cognitive theories of anxiety suggest that these biases might actually play an important causal role in the etiology and maintenance of anxiety. If people with high anxiety levels are more likely to perceive and see threat in the world around them, then this is going to contribute to symptoms of hyperarousal and increase the chance of negatively evaluating their social interactions. But almost all of this existing research in anxiety has focused on one sense only. So it's basically just used these classic face paradigms where they show people pictures of static faces and ask them to make judgments about them. Some studies have also used words. So they show people threatening and non-threatening words and look at the differences in how they attend to those different stimuli. But fundamentally, these studies have relied on just one sense and a very limited number of stimuli. And that's really not very representative of emotion processing in the real world and the types of emotional processing that we have to do in everyday life. So the aims of my PhD were to contribute some initial evidence towards characterizing multisensory processing in anxiety, with a view towards understanding the potential implications for the etiology and treatment of anxiety-related disorders. So I'm going to run through for you today a couple of the studies that I did as part of my PhD and some of the key conclusions. So as there wasn't very much background research on this topic, my first study had quite a broad research question. So in the first study, I was asking, does trait anxiety impact multisensory processing of emotional cues in audiovisual displays? So I was starting quite broad here. So in this study, I didn't actually have people with diagnosed anxiety disorders. These were non-clinical individuals with different levels of trait anxiety. And they were split into higher and lower anxiety groups based on the sample median score on the Spielberger Trait Anxiety Inventory, which is kind of the gold standard measure for measuring trait anxiety. And participants had to do a forced two-choice emotion task, where I asked them to judge whether stimuli were happy or angry in different conditions. So participants saw examples of faces, voices, and then also combined faces and voices. And the combined faces and voices appeared in two different conditions. In the top figure here, you can see an example of a congruent stimulus. So this would be where a happy voice was presented alongside a happy face was presented alongside a happy voice, for example. Whereas in figure 2, you can see an example of an incongruent stimulus, where a happy face was presented alongside an angry voice. So people had to process conflicting emotional information. And we asked them to make an overall judgment about the stimulus as a whole, as to whether they thought it was happy or angry. Now, I've already mentioned the importance of motion and the fact that a lot of previous studies oversimplify emotion perception and just look at static stimuli. So for this reason, I looked at videos of faces. So although you just saw a still image in the previous slide, those were actually dynamic faces alongside voices. But also to learn a little bit more about processing of biological motion, I also used some point light stimuli. So these are stimuli which are created by using motion capture, placing lights on the key joints in the body, and then basically all information is removed apart from the movement of those lights. So I also use these stimuli, which show interactions between two people who were either having a happy or angry interaction, and there were corresponding dialogues as well. So it's probably a little bit difficult to see because of the lag, but that was an example of body motion during a happy interaction. And this one is an example of body motion during an angry interaction. So I also use these stimuli in the study as well. And to separate out effects of multisensory processing that might be specific to certain types of social information, I also used an abstract set of stimuli as well. So I asked people to make judgments about visual flashes and tones to see if any differences in multisensory processing around emotion might generalize to more abstract non-social stimuli as well. So this was quite a large, complicated study because we had multiple different conditions and multiple different types of stimuli. I was just playing my nice point light stimuli again for you. So today I'm going to focus on just how we looked at the results from the audio-visual incongruent trials. So these were the trials where participants had faces and voices together, but the faces and voices were showing mismatched emotions. And I'll just play you a quick example of what one of these stimuli looked like for the faces and voices.
I knew it would happen.
So this was an example of a happy face alongside an angry voice. So in these trials, we couldn't measure accuracy because there was no correct answer, because both emotions, both happy and angry, were being represented in the different sensory cues, one in the voice and one in the face, and we were asking people to make a judgment about the overall stimulus. So instead, the dependent variable that we used here was response index. So we measured the tendency of participants to always respond happy versus always respond angry to these incongruent displays. And we calculated this by subtracting the proportion of happy judgments from the proportion of angry judgments for these stimuli. So scores on this variable varied between -1, which would mean that the person always responded happy, to +1, which means that they always responded angry. So my key hypothesis for this study is that there would be an enhanced negativity dominance effect in the higher trait anxiety group when recognizing emotion in these ambiguous, incongruent displays. And this idea of negativity dominance comes from previous research in neurotypical individuals, which suggests that when we combine different sources of emotional information into one overall impression, negative cues tend to dominate in perception. So when, for example, we're combining negative sources of information with positive information, in general, there's this negativity effect where the negative information tends to dominate more in our perceptions of the overall information. So I hypothesized in this study that all individuals would show a bias towards responding angry for these incongruent stimuli, but that for happy individuals, this effect might be more pronounced. So they might show a higher tendency to respond angry to incongruent stimuli. And this would kind of be indicative of an over-exaggerated negativity dominance effect. So, and that is what we found. We found an enhanced negativity dominance effect for anxious individuals. So let me just orient you a little bit to the graph here. So remember that possible scores on this variable could range between -1 and 1. So a score of -1 would indicate that people always responded happy, and a score of +1 would indicate that they always responded angry. So you can see that both groups were significantly biased towards interpreting the stimuli as being angry. So when they had angry and happy cues together, they were more likely to weight the angry cues in their judgments more than the happy cues. But there was also a significant main effect of anxiety, which showed that people in the higher trait anxiety group were overall more biased towards making judgments of angry. So there was this exaggerated negativity dominance effect that we hypothesized that we might see. And we can imagine how this might be related to cognitive theories of anxiety, which suggests that anxious individuals may find it more difficult to disengage their attention from threat-related cues. So in order to interpret the implications of these results for our understanding of sensory processing and anxiety, there is a couple of additional things about the results that we need to consider. So in different task conditions, which I haven't spoken about so much today, we also analysed accuracy of emotion recognition for faces and voices when they were presented in isolation, so in auditory and visual only stimulus condition. And we found that there was no significant effect of anxiety in accuracy perceiving these emotions from single cues. So this rules out the possibility that differences between groups in this response bias measure were because angry individuals simply perceived individual happy cues as less accurately than angry cues. and instead suggests that the biases we're seeing in the processing of the incongruent audio-visual stimuli must be related to how they're integrating the face and voice information together. So we suggested that this might be indicative of an independent, specific alteration of multisensory integration in anxiety. And interestingly, we ran this analysis for all three of those stimulus types that I talked about. So faces and voices, the body motion and voices, and also those abstract tones and visual flashes. And this effect was only present for face and voice stimuli. So that suggests that this sort of negativity dominance effect for multisensory stimuli might particularly apply to only sort of salient social cues like faces and voices, and might not apply more broadly across different types of abstract information. So that was all very interesting, but it definitely did leave some open questions. This was basically the first study on this topic, so it made us think that maybe we were right to think that there might be multisensory differences in anxiety, and these might be related to threat-related biases that we'd considered from the earlier research. But there were some open questions that remained to be addressed. So one of those questions was what we were seeing in this study really an enhanced negativity dominance, or was it a threat-specific bias? So in this study, we only looked at two emotions, happy and angry. And angry is both a negative emotion, but it is also related to interpersonal threat. It's a sign of potential threat. So we couldn't separate out whether this was a threat-specific effect or just a general negativity-related effect. So that's something that we wanted to look at in the next research study. We also only considered a very small subset of multisensory processes in the previous study. One thing that we didn't look at was a process called multisensory facilitation. So in the first study, we focused on how people process conflicting information. So when they have multiple sources of emotional information and they're conflicting, how do they reconcile that to make judgments? But multisensory facilitation is an important multisensory process that describes the perceptual benefit that is gained through multisensory integration of multiple emotion cues. So, for example, research has shown that when you have a face and a voice together that show the same emotion, you're able to process that much more accurately and recognize the emotion more accurately than when you have the sources of multisensory information separately on their own. So this kind of facilitation effect that results from integrating congruent information was something that hadn't been looked at in anxiety before to see if that was different or altered. And that was something that we wanted to look at going forward. So our second study was asking a more specific research question. This time we were asking, does trait anxiety impact multisensory facilitation for emotional faces and voices? And we chose to focus just on face and voice stimuli going forward, because that was where we saw the main effects in the first study, suggesting that these multisensory differences might be specific to those very salient social signals. So again, this study was using people with high and low trait anxiety, but this time, rather than collecting trait anxiety data for the whole range of people and then just splitting the sample based on the median, this time the sample was split into groups based on suggested clinical cutoffs. So these weren't people with clinically diagnosed anxiety, but the people in the high anxiety group had a score beyond the suggested cutoff for clinically meaningful anxiety symptoms. So this approximated more a clinical anxiety population than the previous study. And we used a similar forced to choice emotion task, where again, people had to look at face and voice stimuli and decide what emotion they thought was being shown from a small number of options. But this time we just had unisensory and congruent stimuli. So we had faces on their own, voices on their own, and then combined faces and voices. But this time the emotion in the combined faces and voices always matched. So we would say the information was congruent. And in order to tap into that open question about whether multisensory differences in anxiety are due to a negativity effect or a more threat-specific effect, this time we focused on 3 emotions. So as well as looking at happy and angry, we also introduced the sad emotion. because this is a negative emotion that doesn't have any inherent threat value. So by comparing responses to sad and angry, we can see if any anxiety-related differences are likely to be specifically related to threat or related to more general negativity biases. So the way that we measured individual differences in multisensory facilitation in this study was by investigating statistically optimal integration, which is a prominent model that is used to describe multisensory integration in the general population. And it's based on the maximum likelihood estimation model of statistics. So it's sometimes also known as the maximum likelihood or the MLE model. So a little bit of maths in this slide, but I promise I'll go through it as quickly and painlessly as possible. So this framework suggests that when we integrate information from across multiple senses, this is achieved via a reliability-weighted linear average of the different sensory signals. So imagine we have a situation where we've got lots of different emotion cues. We've got voice information, we've got odor information, we've got face information, and those are varying in how reliable those different cues are. If we were combining those sources of information in line with this statistically optimal model, reliable signals would receive a high weight in our judgment, and unreliable signals would receive a lower weight. So this rule is described as statistically optimal because this should always produce the most reliable overall representation. And we can imagine how this might be a useful strategy in everyday life, where sensory signals are often noisy and ambiguous. So for example, imagine you have forgotten your glasses, you've left them at home, someone is walking towards you down the corridor, but they're still at quite a distance, so their face is quite blurry, but they're talking to you. In that situation, it's probably going to be most efficient to prioritize processing of the auditory information to try and understand their emotional state compared to the visual information, because the auditory information is going to be a lot more reliable in that situation where you can't see the person's face so clearly. And statistically optimal integration is described in the formula given on the slide. So you don't hugely need to understand this to be able to kind of follow what the results were. But basically, this rule suggests that variance in accuracy recognizing emotions from audio-visual conditions will be equal to the variance in accuracy in the audio-only condition multiplied by the visual-only condition divided by the sum of the variances in those two conditions. So in our study, we wanted to measure how well individuals' perceptual estimates resembled the predictions of this model. And we did this by calculating MLE difference scores. So we subtracted the actual variance in the accuracy of emotional judgments for the audiovisual stimuli from the prediction that we would make based on this model. And what we found is that integration more resembled the statistically optimal model for angry stimuli, specifically in the higher anxiety group. So just to orient you a bit to what these scores actually mean and what is being shown in this graph, the x-axis, where the x-axis crosses the y-axis at a score of 0, if you had a score exactly on that line, that would indicate that your integration was exactly in line with the predictions of this model. So you were integrating the cues optimally in that condition. A negative score would mean that your integration was suboptimal. So you weren't integrating the cues as efficiently as possible to maximize perceptual benefit in the audio-visual condition. So what you can see here from the graph, so the black bars indicate the results for the low anxiety group and the gray bars for the high anxiety group, is that high anxiety individuals were significantly more likely to optimally integrate angry emotional cues compared to low anxiety participants. So this means that in contrast to low anxiety participants, individuals in that high anxiety group were able to use all of the information available to them in an optimal way in order to reduce uncertainty by weighting the face and voice information in their judgments in a way that was proportional to the relative reliability of the two cues. And this potentially suggests that individuals with high trait anxiety have multisensory mechanisms that are especially fine-tuned for perception of threat-related emotions. And as in the first study, these group differences occurred in the absence of any significant difference in accuracy between anxiety groups for stimuli in any single emotion or modality condition. So this suggests that these anxiety-related differences were specific to how information from audio and visual cues were being combined, rather than more general differences in sensory processing. So I realize if you're outside of the multisensory research world, that probably sounded quite complicated. So I'll kind of give a summary of my key takeaways from those first two studies. So based on those first two studies, it seems that individuals with high trait anxiety show this negativity dominance effect when judging emotion from conflicting cues. So where there are multiple sources of information available and they're having to integrate them to make a judgment, they're more likely to weight negative information more heavily in their judgments. The results from that second study suggest to us that individuals with high trait anxiety are more likely to optimally integrate threat-related, so angry cues, compared to low trait anxiety individuals and compared to non-threat related cues. So they're better at integrating threat-related information to help them make more accurate judgments. And together, this suggests that individuals with high trait anxiety might have multisensory mechanisms that are specifically fine-tuned for processing of threat, that is in line with that research I introduced at the start of the talk that has been done using just faces and words, which suggests that there are these threat-related perceptual biases and that these might play a really important role in the etiology of anxiety. So this is not only informative about emotion processing in trait anxiety, because trait anxiety is a process or construct that is relevant to many different disorders. So we might also consider whether similar multisensory alterations might be present in other clinical populations, such as individuals with anxiety or stress-related disorders, such as PTSD. So this next study is just going a little bit off the topic of anxiety, but I like to talk about it because I think it's a really cool experimental setup. So in the next study, we decided to examine the role of multisensory processing in the development of intrusive memories using an experimental paradigm known as the trauma film paradigm, which I will explain in just a minute. So the main research question for this third study was, could biased multisensory integration be linked to intrusive trauma memories? So established theory about PTSD and trauma suggests that maladaptive processing of trauma experiences can result in fragmented memories, which are intensely re-experienced in a way that causes a sense of persistent current threat. And these unwanted intrusive memories are associated with PTSD development. So we hypothesized, based on what we saw with high trait anxiety, that if individuals exhibited biased multisensory integration, this could lead to enhanced threat processing as stressful life events, and it could result in more intrusive memories and increase the likelihood of developing PTSD. And we investigated this using the trauma film paradigm. So in the trauma film paradigm, participants are shown film content depicting traumatic events. And in our study, we used footage from a simulated car accident. And this elicits temporary responses that are similar to symptoms that people experience after real-life traumatic events. So this is just a temporary response. So this is typically measured only over a week after people are exposed to the trauma film. So in our study, we showed people the trauma film, and we gave participants a paper diary and asked them to record intrusive thoughts and images about that trauma film over 7 days after being shown the film. And we increased the immersiveness of this paradigm by presenting the trauma film using virtual reality, which is one of the ways that the ecological validity of this paradigm has been improved in recent years. So in order to measure multisensory processing, before participants were exposed to the trauma virtual reality experience, they completed an emotion recognition task, which was very similar to the tasks that we used in studies 1 and 2, where they had to accurately recognize angry, sad, and happy emotions from audio, visual, and audio-visual face and voice expressions. And we calculated multiple different outcomes related to multisensory processing from these tasks. But today I'm just going to focus on one in the interest of time. I'm going to focus on multisensory facilitation. So we calculated a multisensory facilitation score for each stimulus emotion by subtracting the percentage accuracy in the most accurate unimodal condition. So this was either face only or voice only, depending on whether the person was better at recognizing faces or voices, from accuracy in the audio-visual condition. And basically, the way that we interpret this metric is that individuals who had higher scores on this outcome are those who integrated information from faces and voices more effectively in the audio-visual condition. So this is just an overview of the intrusion frequency data. So this isn't telling us anything about our multisensory outcomes yet. It's just to give you an impression of what this data looks like. So number of intrusions that people reported using the paper diary is plotted on the x-axis, and then the number of participants reporting that number of intrusions is reported on the y-axis. So owing to the fact that this study was very novel and we measured multiple different outcomes, we used data-driven methods, a method known as sequential stepwise regression, to explore which behavioral outcomes from the multisensory emotion task would be most influential at predicting the number of intrusions after the trauma film. And you can see, those of you who've been using JASP to look at the histogram of your data and see if you've got a normal distribution, that this data has a very unique distribution that is definitely not a normal distribution. And that's what you tend to see in these trauma film paradigms, is that a lot of people experience no intrusions at all. They experience none or just one or two. And then a much smaller number of people experience a high number of intrusions. So because of that, we have to use a particular type of regression that can take into account this strange distribution of the data, known as a negative binomial model. And this showed us that multisensory facilitation scores, particularly for angry stimuli, so these scores are telling us how good people were at integrating angry faces and voices together, predicted intrusion frequency. So the better that people were at integrating angry face and voice cues in the audio-visual condition, the more likely they were to experience intrusive memories of the trauma after the trauma film. So overall, the findings from study 3 suggested that a tendency towards greater multisensory integration of threat cues predicts more intrusions after a trauma simulation. And this is consistent with our previous findings in anxiety, which suggests that multisensory threat processing is associated with higher trait anxiety. So given the important role that intrusive memories are thought to play in the etiology and maintenance of PTSD, these findings also potentially suggest that enhanced multisensory threat processing could predict a greater likelihood of PTSD development after trauma. And so the next study that I planned as part of my PhD was to investigate multisensory emotion processing with PTSD patients. So I'm almost there. Let me just wrap up with a few key conclusions and future directions. So my key conclusions from the research I presented today is that anxious traits modulate multisensory processing in a valence-dependent manner. So they specifically affect how threat-related information is integrated and processed. Altered multisensory integration could contribute to these overall emotional biases that have been suggested to be so important in anxiety by amplifying the weighting of negative cues when people are trying to process multisensory emotional information. And findings from the trauma film study suggest that similar multisensory biases could contribute to the development of intrusive memories after trauma. So I think there are some really interesting findings here. So I'm keen to carry on with this line of research. And just to outline a few of the future directions for this area of research. So I've actually already finished running a study looking at multisensory emotion processing in PTSD. And in addition to the kind of behavioral measures that we had in the previous studies, I also looked at the effects on physiological and brain responses using ECG and EEG. So that was a very big and time-consuming study. Currently don't have any results because it takes an extremely long time to process ECG and EEG data. So I'm currently in the midst of that at the moment. When I have got to the point of having gone through all of that data and cleaned it and understood what it means, it's also an eventual aim of this research project that the behavioral and EEG data from these studies will be subjected to computational modeling to allow us to design a classification algorithm that can discriminate between PTSD patients and individuals with high trait and anxiety based on differences in multisensory processes. And I have collaborators in the Department of Mathematics at Exeter University who will be working with / hopefully doing this for me because my maths is not up to that challenge. And the findings from my PhD also have potentially interesting implications for the use of treatments that aim to improve social and emotional processing in anxiety and possibly PTSD as well, particularly treatments that have an important sensory component. And two examples might be cognitive bias modification, CBM, or virtual reality exposure therapy. So if you haven't heard of it, CBM involves training patients to disengage from negative emotional cues in order to reduce biases towards threat. And the findings from the studies of anxiety that I've presented today suggest that cognitive biases towards threat might actually be most evident when using multisensory stimuli. So currently, these CBM paradigms generally only involve visual cues. So I suggested that maybe they could benefit from incorporating multisensory stimuli, and that might make them more effective. Similarly, virtual reality exposure therapy is a therapy that is being increasingly used with PTSD patients, and it involves exposing individuals to sensory cues that are reminders of their trauma using virtual reality to give them the opportunity to mentally live through stressful situations and allow them to incorporate new perspectives into their distressing memories of the event. And the virtual reality environments that are being used for this application are inherently multisensory. So they have both visual and audio components. Some of them even have haptic and odor components as well. So an increased understanding of how multisensory perception works in PTSD might help us to actually optimize these virtual reality environments and improve the efficacy of these treatments. So I have plans for future study to compare the effectiveness of unisensory versus multisensory treatment conditions for both cognitive bias modification and virtual reality exposure therapy. So stay tuned for some more VR stuff in the future. So I just wanted to end by acknowledging the people who helped me with this research. So Emma Denny, who was a master's student at the University of Exeter, who actually collected the data for the trauma film study. So very grateful to her. My supervisory team for my PhD at the University of Bath and the University of Exeter, and the MRC for funding my project. If you're interested in the kind of stuff I do, you can follow me on Twitter at Heffer Naomi, or for slightly more fun stuff, you can follow my SciComm account at Senseless Psych. And I do have a new podcast coming out soon on my website about my PhD research. So just a shameless plug there before I finish off. So yeah, should I stop sharing, Tash? Would that be?
Yeah, you can stop sharing now if you want to. Thank you so much for that. That was really brilliant and really interesting to hear more about what you've done and what you're doing. If anybody has questions, I've just turned on the Q&A. So please pop any questions that you have in the chat, or you can just raise your hand or turn off your mic if you want to ask questions like that. That's absolutely fine. So I'll kick us off with a question.
Sure.
I would be very interested to know what kind of sample sizes you had in the studies that you did, particularly for study 2. I was wondering how many participants you ended up having in the high trait anxiety versus the low trait anxiety groups.
Yeah. So I think the first study was around 54 participants. So there were 28 people in each group. And that was in line with my G-power calculation. Obviously, everybody always do your G-power calculations. But that was an exceptionally long study because I was looking at lots of different stimuli and lots of different conditions. Participants were doing those tasks in the lab for 3 hours. So it wasn't really feasible to test any more participants than that. The second study, as you said, I didn't just recruit anybody and measure their trait anxiety. I recruited them based on these cutoffs.
Yeah.
I think there were 35 people in the high anxiety group and 28 in the low anxiety group. And it was actually much more difficult to recruit people for the low anxiety group. And I think that's because I was recruiting primarily from a student population. And students are anxious. A lot of students are anxious for lots of reasons. So I found it much easier to recruit for that higher anxiety group than I actually did for the low anxiety group. I had to be a bit more kind of strategic with trying to recruit for that lower group. Yeah, and I think the trauma film study, obviously that had a slightly different design because that was like a correlational design rather than a split groups design. I think we ended up having about 54 people in that study. So originally we were aiming for 80 something, but that study was being done during just as COVID happened. So we had to shut the labs. So we had everyone booked in and then we had to shut the labs. So yeah.
Wow, thank you. And we have a question from Jerry.
Hello again. That was brilliant. Thank you. Very interesting stuff. I'm still processing the information and the implications, to be honest. So instead of having to think too much myself, I'll ask you a question.
Sure.
Does this inform at all our understanding of the origins of anxiety?
The origins of anxiety. I mean, it kind of just extends what we already think about in terms of these cognitive theories of anxiety that suggest that anxiety is fundamentally driven by an over-attention to threat, that's kind of at the heart of it, like an over-processing of threat that contributes to hyperarousal. And obviously then that kind of feeds into this vicious cycle where because you're more experience higher sympathetic drive, higher hyperarousal, you're then more likely to see threat in the environment. And it kind of goes round in this cycle. So I guess what my research is showing is that this might apply even more in ecological conditions than we actually thought before, because these biases had been observed before when we were just looking at really simple face pictures or words. But actually comparing my multisensory conditions to my unimodal conditions in these studies, these biases seem to be even more evident in multisensory conditions. And multisensory conditions are everyday life conditions. Because, you know, it's very rare that you're just processing one source of information. So I don't know if it tells us anything new or hugely insightful, but I think it tells us that those threat-related biases are probably even more important than we thought they were based on the previous research that was done in more simple conditions.
Reassuringly, that's what I suspected. So thank you.
And we have a question in the chat from Bethany, which I think you kind of covered at points in your talk, and also it's quite a broad question, but she's wondering how you would say your research is important to society.
Yeah, so kind of several points that I've already touched on. In the part of what I was just saying in relation to Jerry's question is that we're basically taking a mainstream theory about anxiety and the role that like attention to threatening information plays in anxiety that has previously only been investigated in very simplistic paradigms that aren't very sort of indicative of everyday life, and showing that this is likely to apply even more in everyday life situations. So we're kind of increasing the ecological validity of that research that the theory is based on. As I said, I think there are, looking forward, obviously this research isn't directly translatable to treatment, but I kind of hinted at what I thought some of the implications were, especially for treatments that involve a strong sensory component, which involves showing people stimuli or getting them to process emotional cues. Multisensory processing is really key to ecological emotion perception. So I think my research is kind of suggesting that we need to be seriously considering the role of multisensory processing when we use those kind of treatment approaches. And we need to do some more research to try and optimize that. So that's why I'm keen to do some research comparing, you know, virtual reality conditions where you just have the visual stimulation to conditions where you've got visual and audio environment, and maybe also Some VR simulations are really cool. You can wear like a haptic vest as well, so you get an additional source of information, and comparing the efficacy of those for reducing anxiety. Yeah, because I think that's likely to play an important role. And we're kind of proceeding with these treatments without really the key underlying knowledge about how multisensory perception works in these conditions, because it is different from unimodal perception. And I think that's kind of a general message from me, is that when we do studies of perception, obviously we do need to study visual perception, audio perception, different types of perception in more depth. But I think a lot of the time we're missing out a huge chunk of information by just focusing on one sense, because there is so much more going on when you're having to process information from different senses together. It changes activity in the brain. It changes the strategies that we use to make judgments. So yes, that would kind of be my wider message, is that if we really want to understand perception, which is important for lots of areas of society, then we need to consider the role that multisensory processing plays more often than we currently do.
Amazing, thank you.
Welcome.
Related to that, I suppose, I was just wondering, when you've got incongruent senses, so you've got auditory and visual, is there any evidence for which one might bias people more, or does that really depend on the individual?
Yeah, so kind of the mainstream theory about multisensory integration is this idea of statistical reliability that I went into a little bit, so that we tend to use a strategy that mirrors that statistically optimal idea, that we weight more heavily in our judgment the cues that are more reliable. And quite usually for emotion perception, that's visual information, that's facial expressions. Because facial expressions are such a rich source of emotional information, particularly dynamic expressions, because then you not only have the sort of static areas of the face that you can decode emotion from, but also the motion. So normally that is faces. So people tend to show a kind of face dominance, which I did see a little bit in my first study. I saw like a pattern of face dominance in the low trait anxiety group, but that didn't seem to be there in the high trait anxiety group. They just had this pattern of negativity dominance. So that's why it's kind of suggesting that anxiety might bias the strategies we're using for multisensory integration. So we're no longer using the most optimal bit of information from a reliability point of view. We're just using the more negative bit. Did that answer your question? I forgot.
Yeah, that did answer the question. And is that related to what you blur out the faces? Is that how? Why do you do that? Is that?
Yeah, so that's related exactly to the question that you just asked. Is that in order to encourage people in those audiovisual conditions to integrate the information, because people generally won't integrate if one source of information is so much more reliable than the other. So if, for example, like the visual information is 100 times more reliable than the voice is unlikely to have any impact on our overall judgment, because we're just looking at the face. So because faces have a tendency to be so much more reliable, and I wanted to study individual differences in these integration effects, I blur out the faces to reduce the reliability down to a level that is roughly equal to the voices. And that's actually really difficult to do. Like, I probably spent most of my PhD piloting different levels of noises on the faces to try and make the faces equally reliable to the voices. And I still didn't achieve it perfectly. But yeah, this face dominance is, we are so good at processing faces. Like, we are crazy good at processing faces. Like, I could add a 90% noise to the faces. So literally like a 90% blur, and people would still correctly identify the emotion upwards of 80% of the time. So people are hugely good at processing faces, and it's a problem when you want to study integration effects. So yeah.
And it makes sense, even just thinking like through COVID, when everyone's wearing masks, how more difficult it was to interpret what people were saying and how they were showing their emotions when half the face is covered as well.
Definitely. And that kind of links to that McGurk thing I was saying at the start as well, is that obviously I focus mainly on the effects of multisensory processing on emotion perception, but visual cues are also hugely important for processing speech. And I think a lot of us didn't realize that until people were wearing masks. and we found that we couldn't tell what they were saying, even though the volume of what they were speaking wasn't any quieter or anything. But most of us didn't realize how much we were also relying on their mouth movements to clarify the ambiguities in what they were saying. So yeah, I think that's the whole face mask wearing issue has been a really powerful example of some of these points in recent years.
Does anyone have any other questions? We've still got a couple of minutes left.
I'm okay if people are done.
Yeah, I think nobody has any more questions there then. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, everyone. It was great to see you all here, and we'll see you at our next one, which will be in January. And yeah, thank you again so much, Naomi. That was absolutely fascinating.
No worries. Thank you very much, everyone.
No.
Oh, did you see Kylie's comment?
Lovely comments there. Like, so good.
Oh, you're still recording.
Oh yeah. How do I stop it?
If you click on the 3 dots, and then there should be an option that says manage recording.
Oh yeah.